All right, I just wanted to briefly walk through row 5 of the rubric and show you an example from one of the past high scoring samples that I have included here. So, row 5 is about selecting and using text evidence. Um, so, this is not so much about how to grammatically incorporate text evidence, although you need to be doing that in a way that relies more on your own commentary and how you weave the text evidence into your own writing rather than having huge chunks of quoted text evidence. So, using methods like summarizing and dropping in shorter quotes for a greater effect would be more helpful. But row 5 is specifically for a high scoring response, asking you to make sure you include relevant, credible, and sufficient evidence to support your argument. So that's actually some of that's not so hard to do. You just have to make sure that you mention the credibility, for instance, of either the study itself, if it's a study, or the authors of the paper, if it's a paper, as you go, and not take it for granted that the reader knows that the author or study is credible. The relevance of the quote or the text evidence or the source that you're using might be obvious, but you need to keep in mind that this is something that kind of can be woven into the explanation section. It can come at the beginning, but it doesn't need to do it in a way that distracts from what the evidence is actually giving you. So, more natural way is to weave it in. And I wanted to show you an example of that from one of the papers, the sample papers. And sufficient evidence would just mean that you rely not only on evidence, but that you support everything you're saying with evidence. Your argument is your idea, but you need to make sure that experts are supporting each facet or perspective within your idea. So if you look at this sample from 2018, and I do want to point out that 2018 and 2019 both have the same row 5 as we do, but if you look back at the 2017 selection, the criteria for row 5 is different. So just keep that in mind if you're looking through these samples. But this is the virtual reality sample that in which the author is making the argument that there could be some important changes made to virtual reality to improve the relationship between the viewer and the content. And so I just wanted to look at this paragraph in the middle of this paper, which is talking about media violence and youth. So one way that this author wove in or scored high points for row 5 by weaving in credibility and relevance is to say things like, when they introduce this piece of text evidence, they preface it by saying Craig Anderson, a member and contributor of the Association for Psychological Science. And you all have been doing that throughout this. This is just a reminder that you can use that sort of a positive phrase inside of those commas after the name of an author or researcher in order to expand on their credibility. And that also touches on relevance because we're talking about the psychological effects of media violence. And so this is a member of the Association for Psychological Science. So the author goes on to say that he determined that in the short term, spanning from a few years to a few days, media violence increased the likelihood of, and here's where he's dropping in a quote, physically and verbally aggressive behavior, aggressive thoughts, and aggressive emotions. And then he expands and sort of summarizes, saying that Anderson also found that in the long run, media violence exposure leads to a more aggressive persona and thought process, as well as more aggressive beliefs about social behavior and desensitization, which are considerably less reversible than short-term effects. He goes on to say a couple of additionalies. So he cites an additional study by Sandra Calvert. Um, he does not really state their credentials, um, which is fine. This still scored high points because he's pretty much consistently doing that. He is talking here about measuring aggressive thoughts the conductors administered a post-gaming test for participants to complete, and it goes into the details of the study, saying that the study determined that aggressive thoughts and physical arousal. So this is the results of the study, but he prefaces it with including a bit about the methodology of the study. So that's something that you might even find in the beginning sections of a longer paper that you have read for research purposes, but it can be important to include and kind of summarize that here. So the scorers liked that he did that, and at some points included some methodologies of studies. And then toward the end here, he is summarizing how the evidence that he has chosen in this and put into this paragraph supports his overall argument, but he also does that by weaving in some relevance. So he says, as such, the conductors concluded that, so the conductors of this study concluded that immersion has a more profound mental as well as physical impact than observation. Therefore, violent VR journalism covering traumatic and violent events would have a more negative effect on viewers. So the therefore is his conclusion, but you can see how he's woven this in, and it's in a pretty natural way for an academic paper to weave in the fact that the results of the study do speak directly to the topic that he is discussing. I'll just say one last word about this phrase, which I can't seem to highlight. As such, I do think that or a similar phrase can be helpful if you're trying to work on a way to transition into an explanation of both like results or effects of research and relevancy. I personally think this paper way overuses the phrase as such. I also think it overuses the word additionally, but it didn't seem to bother the readers. And remember, those sorts of things, if you feel like you're repeating transitional words or phrases, try to mix it up, but honestly, that's not part of the rubric. So feel free to borrow phrases like as such from this paper or other phrases from similar high scoring papers, because repeating those is far less important than actually including the analysis, the relevancy, the credibility that they're looking for. So hopefully that helps. That's the 2018 sample. I would encourage you to look at the 2019 sample just to see how you think it meets row 5 of the rubric. And we're just going to work on making sure that evidence is fully validated and incorporated this week. So happy writing.